You know, I don't know if you want to add anything to what I said there, Kyle, but that's kind of like the transition period in my mind till we get to summer. We get those longer, warmer days, the weeds are starting to emerge, and the insect activity, as the one gentleman was asking about, starts to happen, which brings in the bait fish, which brings in the pike.
Cool. So Kyle, I don't know if you want to add to that at all, or why don't you take us into the summer, and let's switch it up. You get to go first. It's summer now. What are you using for lures of choice? What's the tactic, and where are you going?
I think that after spring, once they go on the, early spring and they start feeding up and they move on, there's kind of the late spring lull. They kind of just disappear for a few weeks, and they're really hard. They're really hard. They just disappear. They'll just, our numbers will drop. A big fish will drop right off for a few weeks, and then it seems that once the weed growth starts and it gets to be about a foot underneath, from the bottom, then the fish kind of go back to that. So it shelters the bait fish. Now the perch are into these areas. The suckers are also in there, and they migrate to it. So the water being still reasonably cold enough for them, you can find them in the shallower water. So we found what's really paid off for us in the last couple of years are pencil reeds. So areas that are closer to shore where the pencil reeds haven't breached the surface yet, but if you didn't know they were there, it's just a maze of bait fish underwater, and those are the spots that we hit. So usually pencil reeds, or ding reeds people call them, because there's a lot of rocks around there. So there's also crayfish and other bugs and aquatics that are in there, and a lot of protection for these bait fish. But for large pike, that's our go-to. So before the weeds breach the surface, so we end up with these big rafts of weed beds for early summer, mid to late June. That's kind of the transition area where they seem to, they go from their shallow bays, then they hit where the pencil reeds are not quite fully all the way up or breach the surface. And then once that happens, they just disappear into those huge cabbage weed beds. And, they spend, another few weeks there until the water gets too warm for them. And then they have to, migrate to deeper water. But, right at that point, my go-to is the storm kick and minnow, 10-inch. They're more inclined to take a bigger bait as the summer goes on. And another thing we also use is bucktails. Any spinner and bucktail, they just seem to move a lot of water, create a lot of noise, and these fish will come a long ways to hit them.
Awesome. Colin, what are your thoughts on summer pike fishing?
I pretty much echo what Kyle was talking about. One thing I want to add to the spring, when you get to the late spring, and again, it depends upon, like if you're on the Attawapiskat, late spring, that's like mid-July. I mean, it's just everything's different way, way farther north. But if you're Northern Ontario, and I'll just say the Sault Ste. Marie and above, and you're in that mid-June, early June, and to me, that's summer kicks in by late June. Again, everything's been so funky with the temperatures the last few years. We've had cold springs, and I bring that up because I was fishing with my daughter at a place that is known for big pike, and we got there. First day was just magic. We were getting them in that 4 to 8 foot transition. The weeds were just starting to come up. It was perfect. And then that night it snowed, and the temperature plummeted, and you could not find a pike. They disappeared. And the only people that were catching them, there was both spin and fly fishers at the lodge when we were there. Nobody could find them. Some of the guys who were jigging in 25 feet of water with minnow tip jigs, very slow, were picking up pike. They were down with the walleye, but they were just sulking big time. And it took 3 days for that cold front to go through, which dropped the temperature of the water, which dropped their metabolism before they flipped in again and they started feeding, and it was very slow. It was really tough fishing, and it was everybody. Didn't matter if you were throwing Rapellas, you were throwing cowbells or cowgirls, nothing was working. So when you get into summer, to add to what Kyle's saying, that's actually some of the again, it's very fun fishing because the cabbage beds and the other types of structure they like to haunt or hang around, that becomes more defined. And as he said, when the water temperatures and it gets hot, they're going to move out of those because they can't be in that 6 to 8 feet of water. It really depends. Like, I'll give you an example. Lake Nipigon. Lake Nipigon has really ice cold water. And I was there in August, and there were giant pike and 8 feet of water in these weed beds. They're not very big weed beds because the water's so cold, but they were there all through the summer. It really depends upon the watershed is like. And Kyle, maybe you want to add to this, because I know like where you are in certain areas, you know, above Nikina, that whole area up there above Lake Nipigon is famous for having cold water upwellings in the lakes. It's one of the reasons why the fishing's so good up there through the season, because the lakes don't cook up like some of the shallower ones that are river fed compared to the ones that have got the spring fed. And where the springs are typically where the walleye move to when it gets hot. And if it's just like the caribou and the wolves follow the walleye, and they're going to be around those springs. I don't know. Do you want to add to that, Kyle?
No, I think you're on the money. I think you're on the money with that. We definitely find that as the summer goes on, the water heats up. The bigger the fish, the more temperature sensitive it is, and it needs to find its happy area. And we have a bunch of springs in the middle of the lake. All our lakes are spring fed, cold water. And if you know where those springs are, you know, in the deeper water, if you have good electronics, you can, you know, troll over them. And the guys that troll seem to do really well with them sometimes, because you'll get them on the graph and they cover a lot of water, and you can just see these big hooks on your electronics just sitting there, and it doesn't take much. So, you know, another popular one is this kick and minnow. And we found over the last couple of years, these Savage Gear line through trout, preferably the 16-inch in the perch pattern or the white and yellow, are killer. They're killer to buy as well, because I think the last one I bought was $75. But I mean, you hate losing one of them, but God, do they work? They work amazing. And when you troll those through those deep holes, they just can't resist it. And you know, it's an easy meal, so they're more inclined to exert a little bit of energy for a big meal than, you know, a lot of energy for several small meals as the summer goes on. And we also find that timing is key. So if we know a storm's coming, pressure change, we like to hit the weed edges, not necessarily in the weed bed, but where these big cabbage beds are. We'll find that 8 to 10 foot of water, and we need adjacent deeper water. You know, we need 20 foot or better close to it, and that's where they go to. So for a short period of time, so you can either fish them in their bedroom or fish them at dinner time, and it's all about timing. And sometimes you connect and hit it right and get them either right on the edge of the weed bed or in that deep water where they're suspended living. And it's, you know, August is our month. We've patterned them very well in August. We know where they go. We know what they bite. And, you know, we'll go from a couple big fish a day to everybody catching several fish in a day. You know, sometimes we'll have 20 over 40 in a week of big fish, which it's nice to see those numbers.
So let me throw this one out to you. Either guy there. Colin, you might want to start because Kyle just went. You know, we talked a lot about the speed in the spring. Safe to say we can crank up the speed once we get into the warmer weather?
Absolutely. In fact, I think that's pretty key. I guess the best way to put it, we always tell people to vary your speeds to find out where they're dialed in. As Kyle mentioned, if they've got a cold front coming in and they know it's coming, and the pressure system's got them on the feed, they're on the binge, I find they're super hot, they're super active. As a fly fisher, sometimes it's hard for me to move the fly, whether on the surface or subsurface, fast enough to get them to trigger. You'll see them follow. It's just like muskie fishing around where I live here in Ottawa. You got to really rock and roll it in to get them to move. But they're and bigger flies. I've got flies here. I'll show you a couple of them. I got some big chickens I throw, and I'm using a 10-weight rod because, just as Kyle said, they're not eating minnows anymore. They're eating perch. They're eating large flies like this. And this is I'm casting flies 8 inches, 9 inches. There are times when the smaller ones will work, and the top water especially, I've got some big rat ones. I've got one that looks like a duck that we throw, and again, you're ripping it in fast, and they'll chase after that duckling and hammer it. You can certainly see why when you see ducklings at the start of the season, Kyle, mother might have 10 of them, and by the end of the season, she's only got 4 or 3 left. But I'm using big flies like this. And we try to use lightweight patterns, a lot of the saltwater type materials that don't hold water so I don't blow my arm off trying to cast these big chickens. But and I've got a bunch of flies. We can talk about the flies later, you know, in terms of what some of my favorites are. But yeah, I definitely go to bigger flies. I'm varying my speed. Sometimes they want it slow. Sometimes I can put it right on the edge of the top of where the cabbages come up. In fact, sometimes those little windows you see on the cabbage, there'll be somebody big sitting down there, and I can bring a topwater early morning, late day, or an overcast day. They'll move up and take. And then I'm working the edges. And just as Kyle said, if you've got a nice 6 to 10 foot deep cabbage edge going along, and there's 25 or more feet of water off to the side, you're going to have monster pike there, because they're going to go in and out based upon the conditions and also based on where the food is.
Right, right, yeah. So they're gonna basically slide up and down that depth range as they're snacking. Listen, Kyle, let me throw this one at you. 2 questions for you. One, I want to go back to what one of our visitors said was about the mayfly hatch. And I know we can't name the date, but can you ballpark, you know, when is the mayfly hatch? Because it's not in May. And then I want to ask you about walleye fishing, because frankly, I would say 50% of the big pike I've caught, I've actually caught when I've been walleye fishing.
Yeah, I mean, once again, it all comes down to temperature, the type of year we're having, when the ice came off. There's so many factors in there. And some years, you know, a few years ago, we had a mayfly hatch that lasted a month. It started every day, just a little bit. It wasn't all at once. So just every now and then, you know, you'd see a little every night, and in the morning there'd be a few shads on the surface. But you know, for the most part, it's usually end of June, that first week of July, typically where we are is when we'll see it. And it really only affects the fishing for part of the week. I'll say 4 days, you know, but they'll still bite. It's just you're not catching one every cast. But I don't think the mayflies affect the pike as much as they affect the walleye.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And what's your experience at the lodge as far as, you know, your walleye anglers stumbling into some monster pike?
I think that it's a real possibility, whether it's spring, fall, or summer. If you're walleye fishing, you know, there's always somebody that's going to be reeling in that 16 to 18-inch walleye, and a 40-inch northern is going to tackle it sideways. And you know, if you're lucky, you net them both. But if not, I mean, it's some great excitement. But it happens, and I mean, you know, later on in the summer, we'll see it more and more. You know, they just want that bigger bait that's moving. And if you got a small, undersized walleye that unfortunately bit your walleye jig, and it's darting around, it's darting for a reason, because something's about to eat it. So, you know, once that, you know, for a little while in the summer until the water gets too warm, it's whatever moves fast and is ugly, they want to crush, and they usually do. So whether it's a spoon, a big cowbell, big ugly fly, if it's moving fast and ugly, they're going to hit it. Just purely out of instinct. I'm not sure if they're hungry, but they whack it, and it'll almost rip the rod out of your hand sometimes. And it's a heck of a lot of fun. And those cabbage beds, they hold literally hundreds of little, you know, small fish, 30 inches and under. And it's great for families and kids to bring kids out there, because they can go at it all day. I mean, the parents get tired taking fish off, but I mean, it's exciting. It keeps their interest up. They're not just, you know, I'm bored. There's none of this, I'm bored.
Yeah, listen, as people that watch the show that you and I did together, I was up there with my family last year, and I can say it is a great place. It is a great place for kids. Colin, any final thoughts on summer before we kind of move into some fall?
Yeah, I want to address the mayfly.
Yeah, please.
The reason why I bring this up, and it's not that I'm encouraging people to use mayflies for pike, but I've been places and the mayflies are hatching. It's, you know, March Browns or whatever. And we've kept a few little pike, the little 5-6 pounders. They're just perfect to eat. And when we opened them up, they had hundreds of mayflies in their stomach. So the pike will eat mayflies too, because it's so easy when they're emerging and they're swimming up. They just swim around with their mouths open, same as the walleye are doing, just chomp, chomp, chomp. Not eating on the surface, but they're chomping away. And I've also been there and witnessed when massive, I was on actually Eagle Lake in the Northwest, I think it was 3 years ago at Century Lodge, and the conditions, we got this massive heat wave, and it was in June, and there's every mayfly in that system, because it was muddy bottom. It's at the southern end of the lake. It's rocky above. It was all mud where we were. They hatched. We shot as much as we could with the low light, And in the next morning, I mean, the whole lake was just covered. I mean, we were getting a float plane, and they had to take an hour to clean the float plane up before we could go. There were so many dead or dying mayflies stuck in every part of it. And they got the pilot was worried about it. But anyways, that whole week, the poor walleye fishermen, they couldn't catch fish. It was, and same with the smallmouth bass. It just shut them down until it was all gone, and then everything resumed. I was lucky. I was fly fishing for pike and muskie. I had no problems. I was in the zone. But I don't really have anything else to add to what Kyle said. I mean, I think everything's bang on. And those little pike, that's kind of like what, for when I tell people to get, try and get into fly fishing, I said, don't run out there and try and get trout. Go catch panfish, like perch and stuff. And those little pike, they're the same for a fly fisherman. Throwing flies on weed beds around, even where I live here in Ottawa, but up at Kyle's place, I mean, you'll have such a ball catching them. And they fight really well. Just make sure you got the long pliers, because they do have a propensity to hoover a fly all the way down. And that's why I always make them barbless, right?
Cool. Listen, I was going to comment on this. It's you've both mentioned, times that the fishing shuts down, and I think sometimes people forget that even in those great fisheries, that we have in these remote locations, you're still going to have some tough fishing from time to time. Would you agree with that?
I'll let Kyle go first.
Yeah, I mean, weather really is a factor with anything else. Weather and, moon phase. I mean, sometimes all the stars align and you can have one horrible day, but, that's when it's time to control what you can control and take care of everything else. But it does happen, but it's rare. Usually a really bad day fishing up here is still really good. So you kind of have to weigh it.
Yeah, it's perspective.
And I agree with you, Kyle. There's certain species I find that are a lot more sensitive to the weather than others. So a good example, brook trout, especially brook trout in a lake, smallmouth bass. Any of the bass anglers that are watching this, they know you get a cold front come in, you get those cold temperatures, bright blue skies right after it goes through. They're not happy fish. They just sit there and soak. And you could be fishing in places. I've been in Labrador, and we've gone into rivers. We canoed in way, way, way from the lodge, and the conditions, we know the fish are there, but they're just not going to eat. And then the next day, it's like somebody turned a switch, and there's tons of fish being caught. So, but as Kyle said, a bad day would be a good day down here.
Yeah. Well, listen, let's make the transition to the fall, and then I got some questions here from the audience that aren't necessarily season specific. But who wants to take a shot then to say, listen, come